Hello, my name's Art Bani Mandib, and today I'm going to be going over Vicarious Trauma, Creators, Audience, and Art as a part of my Isolated Sound PhD project. As I just mentioned, my PhD project has a working title of Isolated Sound, which aims to look at multimedia installation as a depiction of tragedy with a particular focus on the COVID-19 pandemic in the United Kingdom. And how did we arrive there? I've always been fascinated by the way music can bring many different people from all walks of life together, and this is true with tragedy as well, bringing people together over one shared theme who may otherwise never meet. I'm also particularly interested in the way that the arts depict tragedy and how this tragedy can be exploited through alternative narratives for both political and personal exploitation. In conducting this research, I particularly want to see what the role of the creator is after the work is created and what responsibility they have to the wider society. In highlighting limitations with this study, it's important for me to realize and identify that disasters and tragedies come in many different forms, and as such, this research focuses particularly on global tragedies, including terror attacks, genocides, and pandemics. Throughout 2023, I visited different sites pertaining to my research, including the Holocaust galleries at the Imperial War Museum and seeing Auschwitz exhibit in London in January of 2023. In March of 2023, I visited Ground Zero and the National 9/11 Memorial and Museum in New York City, United States. In June of 2023, I visited all of the sites of the London bombing detonations, the memorials present at each site, and the Hyde Park Memorial. And in November of 2023, I visited the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum in Oswiecim, Poland. These site visits are important to my research as I am looking particularly at the Holocaust and 9/11 as case studies, working towards building my project around the COVID-19 pandemic in the United Kingdom. Between April and August of 2023, I conducted my first creative project as part of this research, and this project focused on the 7/7 London bombings. The project explored selfie culture in the wake of tragedy, and in particular how, with modern technology, members of the public taking photos at sites of memorial and tragedy can be interpreted as either respectful or offensive, and a plethora of other descriptors in between. In putting this exploration of selfie culture to the test, photos were captured at the area where each of the 4 bombs were detonated. Alongside this, audio was captured on my personal device while travelling by London Underground to each site. From this footage, 3 pieces of work were created, built off an evolving practice-led research model. This research model I have named the PRISM model because of the fact that I found the most coherent way to interpret the selfies that were captured and the audio that was captured in London was to consider my work through an ethical, moral, and societal lens, taking into account what I personally deem to be the right thing to do, what society may deem to be the proper way of showing respect for such a tragedy, the ethical considerations for how this could affect my audience, and by viewing the work, which of itself is built up of praxis, creation, and reading, building research to create new knowledge in the form of a musical work, I found that the prism was a sufficient and effective way to create as a whole when working with tragedy. However, with this being an initial model, questions did arise as to how the creator put safeguards and protections in place for their own well-being, because when dealing with tragedy, the exposure to negative materials and emotions is present, and it is important to highlight that overexposure, like with most overexposures, can cause a negative effect to the individual. Another question that came out was, how does one mitigate exposure to negative material? And when creating a model for creation, should we pay attention to how one mitigates exposure? So between September and October of 2023, I began looking at ways in which I could use the PRISM model in order to build an effective self-care strategy that could be implemented. Before looking at creating a self-care strategy, I thought it was first important to look at myself and my own experience behind the key events that I was going to be looking at, and to find out keywords and imagery that was in my mind to see what trauma I have pertaining to these events. In order to do this over 4 days, I allocated 3 minutes per day in a block session to write as much from recall as possible based on a set of tragic events. I then translated these from paper into digital formats. Here is the first of my 3-minute recalls based on the September 11th attacks. Here is the second, based on my recollection of studying the Holocaust. Here is the third, on the recollection of the London 7/7 terror attacks. And here is the fourth, based on the COVID-19 pandemic from my own experience. I've also included here 2 other 3-minute sessions that I conducted, but these sessions were based on how I felt about the relationship between the creator and the audience, and how an audience may react to a work. And the other, to the right, is about what I feel could cause negative harm to a creator and the entire process of creating a self-care model. At this stage, I want to highlight that across the previous slides, fear and not understanding arose as key themes. This proved to be something that I will touch upon later on, but this need to understand and process what has happened appears to be central to all of my recollections. So following on from these recollections, I devised this model for self-care. This was the first model. Um, it was designed to fit around the concept of the eye looking into the prism. And within the eye is this revolving cycle of creativity, support, pleasure, and work. The creativity being the output of new work, research, the support being the network around the individual friends, family, NHS, GP. Pleasure being your reward system, going out with friends, watching a movie, cooking a nice meal. And work being the process that leads to creativity, but that doesn't equate to the same pleasure as creativity. In the middle, I've put exposure because the concept within this self care model is that all four of the facets creativity, support, pleasure, and work are spiraling around the exposure. And it's through effective management of those four facets that the exposure time and the damage caused by the exposure potentially is mitigated. This seemed at first to be a strong model for my own processing of events. However, I realized that having it as a graphic was effective only to the extent that you felt confident to engage with that graphic. And so, from my own point of view, I wanted to break this down and really unpack how a creator can effectively manage exposure when dealing with negative content. And that brings us to November of 2023 when I visited the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum. When I visited the museum in the time leading up to the event, I thought I knew how I was going to feel, and I'd kind of mentally prepared myself for what I was about to experience. However, unlike in the other visits that I had conducted in 2023, I felt myself in a state of numbness as soon as I arrived in the site. When I spoke to my wife after, when I was back at the hotel, um, I made a note of saying I don't know how to put this in words other than to say I feel numb. And for a few weeks after that event, the word numb would be something I could say succinctly articulates how I felt about the process. Perhaps this was because I was old enough to have seen 9/11 unfold on the TV and I saw it in reality. Perhaps that was because I lived through the pandemic, and thus the difference between the pandemic and 9/11 and 7/7 is that I wasn't alive to have experienced the global shock of the discovery of Auschwitz-Birkenau. And going back in time, it's I found that the site was so hard to process in one go that it did take weeks to unpack what I'd seen and process it, almost as if my body was protected me in that space. This proved to be a pivotal visit for my research that followed. So between November 2023 and January 2024, I continued to look at the creator's well-being and the exposure to negative experience and content. One thing that came up was autonomy versus precaution. Now, for me, I've always held a belief that creators have to create based on their view of the world, and their output is their commentary on what they see. And through everybody providing their commentary, a dialogue can be created among the populace. However, in light of my visit to Auschwitz-Birkenau, I had a greater understanding of how a set circumstance or a set experience can be hard to process on an individual level. So that led me to think just how much autonomy can one allow the creator to have without considerations to well being? And if we are to have considerations to creator well-being, does that put a role of protection on the wider society? And how can we ensure that the protections are suitable for the creator and that they'll be followed? We can't be medics in this situation. We're not trained doctors. So how can we create a system that is followed to the latter, or is it merely just guidance? And furthermore, is there a requirement to do so? My experience in Auschwitz-Birkenau and on that visit presented me with a result I did not envisage and really made me sit and focus on this autonomy versus precaution. Again, I found myself processing this experience over a prolonged period of time, and intriguingly, I felt compelled to read more into the event in order to inform my practice and comprehend what I had experienced. This is something that I found important to address because I actively had to stop myself from reading or looking into more of the history of the Holocaust. This was because I felt in myself that I had hit my exposure limit and needed to stop. Me being aware of my exposure limit highlights my own personal autonomy, but also provides me with a sense of clarity that autonomy alone cannot be a guarantee of personal protection. As I went through my processing of my visit, I started this body of work for strings called Responses for Strings. From a personal perspective, it was based solely off my visit to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial and Museum, and I designed to push myself as a composer, predominantly focused in blues and folk, by writing for strings, but also the sound of strings resonated in my thoughts. And if I go back to my 3 minute map of the Holocaust, one of the phrases I wrote was Schindler's List, and the John Williams soundtrack with the violin stuck in my head when I think about that event. So when writing responses for strings, I still had to address the self-care model that I'd earlier created. Now this took many different approaches, but the one thing that always stuck in my mind was being aware of when you have hit a limit to negative exposure. And for someone who might not be able to hit or realize their limit, being able to create a formula or a framework that directs an individual through a creative path that limits their exposure for them. To this extent, I arrived over time with Create with Compassion, which is the name I've given to a guide to preparing to undertake a creative process. It was inspired by a model used by the NHS to moderate alcohol consumption using a pointed system, and was built on research on vicarious trauma in a range of fields from military to medicine and journalism. I particularly found that there was a lot of correlations from journalism and the vicarious trauma present in journalism and music and film. And there was a lot of research present in the realm of journalism to aid in this creation. So Create with Compassion is split into two phases, the preparation stage and the practice stage. The preparation stage is built off the principle of finding out why you want to do the project, building your support network and having it written down so that you have access to your support network, and creating a reward system that you can go to and plan to give yourself that time to unwind when dealing in these high exposure situations. So here is just an example from the network phase. It was based off prompts that were open-ended so that the individual can answer honestly and from their own experience. The next stage was to answer the weekly 14 calculator, which was a series of 10 questions built off research into vicarious trauma assessment, tailored to the creative onset. These questions were multiple choice, with each answer having a weighted number. And at the end of the 10 questions, the individual was to add the number and arrive at a total, which would then be processed into a template A, B, C, D, or E. This was stressed in the document and is stressed now, is a guide and does not constitute medical advice, but it is built off research and my reading into factors that have been explored in journalism and military trauma. As mentioned, once the individual has arrived at a total number, it translates to a template. The template is basically a system that helps to allocate points for different levels of work intensity. So level 1 is light work with no exposure to harmful or explicit content. Level 5 is emotionally and physically intense work that has a significant exposure to the content. Using a traffic lighted system, no matter what template the individual is on, a conscientious decision was made that the individual can only use a level 5 and a level 4 once in a week. And that is just because even though they have landed themselves in a template that says that they are able to manage this exposure time this week, it is good to limit the exposure as a best practice. At first, I thought when designing this and working through my own project that by putting limits on my practice, it would be difficult and limiting on my output. But I actually found that I became more efficient in my work as a whole as I could detach from what I was doing and just enjoy my process more instead of going down a spiral of reading negative material or being too involved in one thing that would be detrimental to my long term practice. Here is just an example of how I scheduled my week. Again, going back to my um, 14 points based off the alcohol units, everything was added to equate to 14, and after every level 5 activity, a full day of rest had to be given in order to unwind. Finally, as part of the Create with Compassion guide, I created a project blueprint. This was important for me as it brought all the facets of the guide together in one page that could be printed out or kept digitally, and the visual allowed me to focus on my why, which brought me back to my project at all times, whilst being able to physically see all of the outreach that was available. The intention behind the weekly 14 process is that it is conducted once every 7 days and updated so that you can respond in real time to how you're feeling. When I implemented this alongside my practice, I found that the Create with Compassion model was built off how I'd naturally responded to my processing of my Auschwitz-Birkenau visit. This I know is individual to me, but by scaffolding the approach to overcoming potential trauma or harmful exposure, I felt that I made the process more therapeutic. And through completing this process, I feel that I've come through a cycle of processing my experience of the Auschwitz-Birkenau visit. Taking this back into my prism model, I find that instead of the I as a representation of self care, the prism model can effectively work with the Create with Compassion guide as a way of allowing the individual to focus on themselves and their well being and then take that into their practice led research. I feel by having a guide that has multiple steps, I am bridging the gap that the original I model did not have because an individual may not be able to just process what that model means. At least the step by step approach provides a practical method to undergo a creative project. But that left me with one final thing, which was how will the audience interpret and react to my work? I brought this up earlier, but it's important to realize that any creator creates because they want to express themselves, and nobody wants to be cancelled or given a negative reputation because of something that they've put out into the world. However, once we do release that work into the world, it is open to a plethora of feedback. So, how can we govern the response and how do we govern our creativity in order to counter this? I sat and worked through models and reflected on this process based off my prior experiences and arrived at this graphic, which I call the connection to tragedy works. Now, although not in its final form, what this symbolizes is that both the creator and the individual are responding to societal expectations about a certain event and how a society expects individuals to respond to a certain event. An example of this would be a minute's silence at Remembrance Day. That's a societal expectation that as a nation the majority conform to. From that societal expectation, both the creator and the individual bring their own views and opinions into the center. Starting with the creator and the red line going in, they bring their process to the work. Once the work has been created, the creator's process, as shown by the red line, goes to the individual because they are absorbing the work that is the result of the creator's process. The individual is then emitting a response, which then goes to the work, and how the creator interprets the individual's response is based off that emission from the individual. However, the important part of this model is the orange arrows, which show that once the red and yellow arrows representing the thoughts of the creator and the individual, alongside the social expectations, meet in the middle, the work itself becomes an entity for creating new knowledge that then can be sent back to both creator and individual. That is important because it shows that the work isn't a finite end, it is a living piece that can be amended and adapted as time goes on and as responses changed. Seeing this in context with my own work, I found that when I heard this practiced by real performers, I personally didn't want to mention my personal story in creating the work because I didn't deem it important. This work was aimed at being a listening experience for any audience, for them to come and bring their own experience to it and take their own knowledge out. The way in which I processed my own trauma did not need to factor into that. And that I still stand by was a conscious effort to omit from the audience. However, I found that the performers were able to give me feedback on how they experienced the playing and reading of the score, which I then took on board and edited my work to make it easier to read and play. Ultimately, this process shows the document to be a living, breathing work because I didn't just create it and that was the end. I edit it and have re-edited it to make it the best it can be. Another example of this cycle is a song by Ian Gill called The Wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald, about a vessel that sank in Canadian waters. Bowie and Gill wrote this telling the story of the Edmund Fitzgerald. He found that through dialogue with families of the victims that there were some inconsistencies with what he had written and what had actually happened on the boat. Ian Gill, talking to Sparlin, said that he made conscious efforts to edit and update his lyrics because he doesn't view himself to be the owner of the event. It's somebody else's story, and he is just one voice contributing to a wider community discussion. But by doing so, he believes that it is his duty to be as accurate as possible. So what you can see in those two examples are the creator bringing a work. If we use Ian Gill as an example, he brings the work into the center, the Edmund Fitzgerald, and the work itself is being amended through this back and forth dialogue to then create new knowledge through the updated song. So though this is still a working model, I feel that there is a lot of scope to explore this further. And my next steps in the process will be to now collate more outreaching works in different styles pertaining to 9/11, the Holocaust, and the COVID-19 pandemic. And I also want to spend time reflecting on this process as a part of my wider project and seeing where I can take these models and challenge them to make them even more effective. So that was my 2023, and thank you for watching.